You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 35, The Edge Case. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. So, are all motorcyclists adrenaline addicts? Well, to the rest of the world, it may seem that way. Normal people don't get why we do this at all, much less why it's so addictive. And maybe they should be listening to this podcast, because in a moment, you're going to meet the real thing. A motorcyclist who has been to the very edge of his addiction to speed on two wheels. His story is about doing things most of us would never attempt, and yet all of us, if we search our souls, can still somehow understand. We'll get to that conversation shortly, but first, this. Well, I've clearly been missing out by not producing a midwinter episode every year. I got some fantastic emails following my interview with Jocelyn Snow, so thank you for those. Jocelyn heard from some listeners too, and she's keen to come back and share some insider scoop about the ADV world, so I guess she liked you. I also see that the show has a couple of fresh reviews on Apple Podcasts, and thank you for those too. I should pay more attention to this because I know it helps people find This Motorcycle Life, so consider this my overdue reminder to let the world know if you like the show. And if you do, it might just help the Movember Foundation too. The listeners were generous as Christmas approached, so I kind of hated it when the Movember Foundation fundraising scoreboard reset to 0 in January. Thanks to listeners Lee, Ronald, Nicholas, and the good people at Pioneer Eclipse Canada for getting us back in the game since then. I really hope you'll add your name to that list because Movember needs us now more than ever. And if you'd like to donate and get a little something for yourself too, then check my show notes for how to buy your very own legendary This Motorcycle Life coffee mug. Net proceeds on every sale go to Movember. Okay, let's go. Well, if you were to ask me if I'm an adrenaline junkie, I would say no without hesitation. I like to be excited, but I don't especially enjoy being in full fight or flight mode. I've always thought that a lot of self-described adrenaline junkies are actually addicted to the spin of the wheel and the relief of survival. And for me, a long life and a sense of possibility are much bigger prizes. Chasing that high has always seemed to me like a kind of high-stakes gambling. And as you probably already know if you're a listener, that's just not me. Even if I sometimes think it would be cool if I were otherwise. So I'm fascinated by people who are, which is why, even though I usually resist being pitched by potential guests, I found this one irresistible when it landed in my inbox last month. The headline was interesting enough. A scorching ride from the beach in San Diego to the beach in Jacksonville, Florida, in a record-setting 33 hours, 10 minutes, aboard a BMW S1000RR, equipped with an auxiliary fuel tank, Bluetoothed radar detection, and a thermal imaging system. Better yet, its rider had made a film about it, a film called No Limits, No Regrets. And it was the film that clinched it, because it turned out that the story wasn't really about that record-setting ride. It was actually a character study of the person who did it, a brash Texan named Axe DeKruif. Well, Axe kind of personifies that little voice inside us that urges us to twist the throttle just a little further. And his film was as honest and confessional a portrait of adrenaline addiction on a motorcycle, or anything else, as I've ever seen. In it, DeKruif pulls no punches about what it takes and what it costs to live a life obsessed by speed. And if there's any part of you that wonders what it's like to venture that close to the edge, closer to that edge than most of us will ever get, well, I thought you just had to meet him. I caught up with Axe DeKruif at his home in San Antonio, Texas. Hey, Axe, how you doing?
Doing great, Bruce. How you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you very much. And thanks for being with me today. And honestly, thanks for reaching out with the opportunity. You've done an incredible thing here. And I have to say that I've also discovered you're kind of a fascinating character, which is probably half the reason I couldn't resist. So I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you including me on your PR campaign.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. So look, I watched your film, which I just devoured on a snowy morning. And there's no doubt that the highlight of that story is the record-setting ride that you took, which we're going to talk about, obviously. But it's clear to me that this film was intentionally or otherwise, was an autobiography in a sense. And that the story you're telling us is sort of about, if I can use this term, is sort of about adrenaline addiction, if that's a fair characterization. So I kind of thought if that reasonably frames what you've done here, it makes sense to me to get to know you a bit before we talk about that ride and about the aftermath of it. So to get us started, I would love to hear a bit more about where you came from. Now, you touch on this in the film, but can you talk some more about your background? What kind of a kid grows up to be Axe DeKruif?
Yeah, sure. So my folks were both from northern Iowa, not too far from you up there. And they met. Dad happened to be living in Florida at the time, and they met down there. And my dad had an old Harley K model, which was kind of the precursor to a Sportster back when he was in the 16, 17 age range. And when he was in Florida, he had an old Sportster. And I was born in Fort Lauderdale. And then after about 6 months, they decided to move back up to where their family was and stuff. So it may have been a whole different path, or maybe just an accelerated path if I would have stayed in Florida. But went up to back to the Midwest in Iowa, and I grew up and went to school there. And I guess grew up is a strong word. It's more an age than anything than maturity. But I went to Iowa State for engineering school, mechanical engineering. And I chose that because growing up, my dad had a blacksmith shop, and I learned by age 8, I was stick welding, and I can remember his welding helmet. In fact, I still have that helmet here now. Was hanging down to the middle of my chest, right? Because I was just a little kid, right. But I was using, the lathes, the benders, the bandsaws, all that stuff at a very young age. So I developed an early appreciation for metal. And I also always kind of enjoyed art. And I taught myself how to do calligraphy and did watercolors and stuff like that. And also, believe it or not, for being a tattooed biker, which sometimes has a stereotype to it, I was also taking accelerated math classes at a very early age. And so I kind of was fortunate enough to have not only, a good science and math background and the intelligence with it, but the hands-on kind of metal work and the appreciation for creating something, right? To build something and be proud of it.
Right.
And also the artistic side. So following Iowa State, I moved down to San Antonio, where I live now again, and worked for a company doing mostly government contracts and projects and stuff. Nothing, it's nothing like super top secret stuff. It was just more industrial type stuff. But I learned to, more about organization and more about speaking, right? And having to do some presentations and all that. And after that job that took me to Jacksonville, Florida, by this point, I'd sold the Harley I had for about 9 years, an old 77 Shovelhead, and just loved the bike. It was fairly abusive, though. You'd buy it the best of everything, and it would continue to break, and I'd continue to get out the wrenches and hope I could make it home. And that was just part of owning it. But eventually, I thought, the last time I rebuilt the engine, I thought it's time to sell it, and I want to build a chopper myself. So I bought one of the kind of kit bikes, is what we used to call them, out of some of the catalogs where you could get the Ultima engine and you'd pick out your frame and all this stuff, and built that. And that's kind of when I started my Y-Chrome Customs company, I guess. And then after moving to Florida, I left engineering for a couple of years and opened up a shop building custom choppers. And so I did that for a while. And at some point, I also thought, well, I do paint jobs. Maybe I'll start painting sport bikes. So I bought an Aprilia Malay, and that was my first sport bike. And then eventually, the bikes kept coming, and cars and everything else, and led on to eventually, who I am today, I guess.
Right. which we're going to talk about. I actually have a question for you about the cars in a minute as well. Now, I heard you interviewed on Motorcycles and Misfits. I thought you did a great job, and it was a fun interview to listen to. And it seemed at a certain point in that conversation like you might have been a bit of a pistol when you were a kid, which I doubt you would deny. I wonder if you remember from those days that the first... It's clear to me that you're a passionate builder, but there's also this kind of speed freak, adrenaline junkie, thrill-seeking side of you and I wonder if you remember when that first emerged and how that felt.
Yeah, it's, to pinpoint it is tough, but I can tell you and I've tried to trace it back, as you saw in the movie, was it the Charlie Brown racetrack trying to speed against dad, as an infant, basically, or what caused that. But, as a kid, I'm one of these that grew up watching Smokey and the Bandit and Cannonball Run and Dukes of Hazzard on Friday nights on CBS or whatever it was. And, it's just something that it looked fun, right? You'd see, Bo and Luke out there shooting bow and arrow with dynamite on it and ripping through the backwoods. And I thought, man, that looks fun. And eventually, when I got to the point of being able to drive myself, it was the family Delta 88, so it was in the sports car, but dad also had a beat up old Porsche 914. And it was it hadn't been well cared for, but it was a fun car though. And the steering was the handling was impressive. And even though it was falling apart, there was something, and you could run through the gears and feel the RPMs and stuff. And, at 15, I had a moped that I had for my paper route, and I was driving around without a license like I shouldn't have been. And some car pulled out in front of me, and I hit him at full speed because I was looking back at my buddy that I was beating in the race, and flew over the hood of a car and ended up on the other side. So I learned early that there was danger to it. And I think it's hard to have excitement without fear at some level. And so those started. And then when I turned 16 and I had a 78 Cougar and put the Kreger SS's on it. And the guy before me, he'd had air shocks already. So I had it jacked up in the back. And, part of that was so that I could get out of my driveway when the snowplow went by. I could have the back end clear and tire. And, but, taking that out on the road and just stepping on it and just see what this thing's got. And, that's when I started to really get that feel for there's something very primal, I guess, to me about feeling that big old V8 roaring under the hood and hanging on for dear life and, navigating these curves and just stomping it down the straights and watching the world go by. But that's where I really started to get a taste for it, I think, was just, basically as soon as I got behind a wheel.
Yeah, that's sort of how it seems. Because there are probably a lot of people in the world who would describe themselves as adrenaline junkies. But it seems to me the most compelling evidence to me that you were the real thing is the variety of machines that you've had. Like every country boy, you went through a car phase because you can't kind of get dates or a job without one. So we meet the Mercury Cougar, but I know. So, but you don't often see this. You used the word stereotype earlier. You don't often see the same person own a chopper and an S1000RR, or the same person own a Mercury Cougar and a 911 twin turbo. And so I'm kind of curious,
exactly.
Right? Like, so stereotype, yeah, maybe on the surface, but it's not a tidy fit. So I kind of wonder what's behind that. Did you just want to experience everything, or has it been some kind of quest for you?
Well, I guess I didn't. I'm trying to think like where I kind of viewed it as I progressed through the cars, like the 914 to me, it was like, I love the Cougar, right? It was that big V8 and I love the Kregers on it and stuff. but there was something about the handling of that little beat up 914 that was just amazing to me, how well that handled. And I think, that I can appreciate a lot of different things mechanically and about driving and stuff. And even now, like one car is a supercharged big old V8 that gets horrible mileage Cadillac, right? Big and heavy. And it's a 6-speed, standard tran yet. And I love that car. But right next to it, I've got the Turbo S, and it's a dual clutch. It's very smooth. It's more surgical. It goes through curves like crazy. It's the all-wheel drive. And, if you told me, dude, you got to pick one or the other, I don't know what I do, because they're such different, unique animals. And I can find so much I love about both of them. And same with the Chopper and the BMW. The Chopper, I think, to me, those always stood out a little bit because Harleys and Choppers, there's a guy that I grew up with in Britt. He was the town biker. He lost a leg in a wreck. He had an old shovel head. He rebuilt almost every year, repainted almost every year, super fast for an old shovel head. And he told me once, he said, if I won a brand new Harley, the first thing I do is tear it all apart and make it mine. And I guess as a young, impressionable kid just starting out, it kind of stuck with me. And so that ability to take a Harley or a Chopper and completely change the look of it and just make it yours. So there's somewhat of an artistic aspect to that I can appreciate, where, the Aprilia is pretty much stock and I love the bike, but I don't have my signature on it as much, I guess. It hasn't been, made mine. So those are different ways that they can appeal to me in a different riding experience altogether. Riding down to A1A in Florida on the Harley, I could set the throttle lock and just rip down A1A at whatever speed I chose with no hands on the bars and just watch the sunrise over the ocean. It's a beautiful experience, but it's very different than being in the Rocky Mountains on an S1000 doing ridiculous speeds hanging sideways about, 2 feet from a involuntary skydive, right? They're just a very different experience, but there's so much you can appreciate the historical aspects of back when cars had this, but yet you can appreciate the modern technology of some of the newer stuff. And, so there's just so much to enjoy, I guess. I don't like having to choose and limit myself. Right.
Well, and there's a certain purity to that, but I can't help but wonder whether it requires a certain confidence as well. Because, I think car guys and motorcycle guys, use the term gender neutrally here. I think there's a tendency for us to want to identify with a tribe, and you just seem to not need that. And speaking of confidence, the other thing that kind of came to mind was the image of you tearing into the dashboard of that brand new Cadillac, which just about kind of gave me heartburn to watch. But you were sure it was going to be okay, and you did a great job. And you put the thermal imaging stuff that you installed. It was beautiful, looked new, but man, oh man, like if I was going to drop a car off at your house to do something to, I would not stay around and watch. And so is there something to that? Is it a confidence thing? Where did that, or is it confidence, or is it just fearlessness? What do you think is going on there? Or am I just making this up?
Well, no, it's a really good point. And I used to think the exact same things about my old man growing up, because he would do something, and I'd look at him and I'd think, like, why in the hell would you even try to do that? But somehow he always got through it, and it always came out well. And I mean, he was, very gifted as far as mechanic. I think he was probably tearing the family transmission or trying out of the family car in his, pre-teens almost. And so he's very able to figure things out. But he'd buy a car that he never saw before and just decide, well, I'm going to rebuild the engine of this thing. I've never seen one like this. And, the engine comes out the bottom. What am I going to do now? And as much as it always used to confuse me as a kid, it was really where I started gaining confidence with my own mechanical abilities was at 18, take that back. It was 19 years old. I had my first Harley, that 77, and I bought it as a basket case. The guy had made it 3 blocks from a bar drunk. fell over or hit a parked car, fell over, broke his leg. The bike sat in literally multiple milk crates of parts, came with the skeleton I took home that day. And after it collected cobwebs, and I asked Dad, I said, well, can I do anything with it? Get started? He goes, yeah, go get the manual and start figuring out why that clutch is sticking. And I was terrified because I didn't know anything about Harleys. And so I went and got the manual and I just started reading through and taking bolts and nuts out and figuring it out. And I put the primary all back together. And then one of his buddies, also a Harley guy, said, oh, did you remember that thrust washer that goes on the outside of the starter shaft that, throws out against the primary case? Make sure you have that in there or else you'll crack your primary. And I was like, oh. So I go back to the milk crates and there's the brass washer. So took it all apart, put it back, learned my lesson. And I think what it taught me is that with enough time and effort, and yeah, it's going to take a few bucks to buy new parts, but there's nothing I can't replace on it, right? I can do anything with this and eventually I'll get it figured out. And in the process, I'm going to learn more about it. And that's good, right? I'm going to use this bike and I want to know everything I can about it. So I think that's where this started the confidence that almost maybe grew to a level of arrogance. Because as you mentioned, to buy a brand new Cadillac and start stripping it apart. And I did the same thing with my BMW. When I got it home with 24 miles on it the first day, the first thing I did is I pulled it in and started tearing panels off and airbrushing fire on the bottom of it.
Well, I think that's the one thing that people who are, I want to say country boys, but I don't want to presume on, your background, and maybe I'm just identifying, too much with other people I know. But there's one thing that people like that have in common with engineers, and that is if they're not afraid to break things, and in fact they look for it. And so it made me think of something to do with your film. This is a strange segue, but so first of all, congratulations on having your film selected by the Los Angeles Motion Picture Festival. That's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I thought so. Thanks.
Yeah, well, hopefully the first of many. It's a pretty great story. So that film, which you narrate, begins with the words, "I keep wanting more and more until something breaks." And so I wonder, what did you mean by that? And has that, in fact, really been your story in life?
To some extent, yes. I think that there becomes a point where confidence evolves to arrogance, and it sometimes sticks until you get put back in your place. And I think for example, even in college, I was fortunate enough to be able to get very good grades without working very hard at it. But that wasn't enough for me. So I wanted to go drink a lot in college and drink in class or be hungover and still be able to set the curve and walk out of that class. And it's almost like it was, if life and something was easy for me and I wasn't challenged enough, then I had to go make my own challenges somehow, whether it, however it might be. Right. And there's always that thirst for something more. And I guess if I think back to the heart surgery I had at 34, what I'd done is I'd taken a lifestyle of getting up at 4 a.m. or earlier, going to my day job, quitting at 5, going home and eating one of the Totino's 5 for $4 pizzas or whatever at the time, and go to the bike shop and work till 9 or 10, and then go clean up and then go to the bars with my buddies and drink a bunch of Red Bull vodkas and whatever else until 2 a.m. and then rinse, repeat. And I did that for 2 to 3 years of this, no joke, average of 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. And I just kept going because it's that arrogance of, well, I can do anything. I'm bulletproof, right? I've bounced off airbags twice in cars. I almost drowned and froze to death in that river. I've done this and that. Nothing can touch me. And as I pushed it more until my heart broke effectively and I needed surgery. And so it's those kind of experiences that I've learned about myself, is that if I'm not careful about keeping a tether on myself, I'll just keep pushing it. And that's an addictive personality, right? Is that we always want more. And, Now, a 6-pack isn't enough. The next thing, a fifth of whiskey isn't enough. Well, how far does it go until something breaks? And so that's a very real part of an addictive personality that I'm not, I'm at least self-aware enough to know that about myself.
Right.
And, which is fortunate, but that's the reason I've never touched a drug in my life, because I know that I have a very addictive personality. And I just always thought, you know what, booze is bad enough, but if I ever start drugs, who knows where that's going to go. And so I learned that it's easier to abstain than even moderation is just a really difficult concept for me.
Right. Yeah, I got that impression. You show a lot of self-awareness in the film. You said something about your heart surgery, and I don't mean to pry, so you don't have to answer this, but
oh, that's fine.
Did you, in fact, medically cause this yourself, or are you just kind of blaming yourself for it? I don't know what the particulars of the situation were.
Well, it's a combination. So there's always a nature and nurture thing, right? And in a human or a piece of them. And in this case, I was diagnosed in about junior high with a heart murmur, which it's mitral valve prolapse is the fancy word for it, but basically means that one of the valves in your heart is leaking. So, if you're mechanical at all and you can think about a pump, then you know that when the pump tries to push fluid, if there's a leaky valve upstream, it's going to push fluid backwards, not just forward. And it basically means that I'm always going to run out of breath, air, oxygen a little bit sooner than somebody with a healthier heart. And that means that my heart's going to enlarge and other things. Now, when I was diagnosed with that, my mother told me that her dad, who he ended up living into his early 90s with the exact same diagnosis, mitral valve prolapse, worked on the farm all his life and stuff. And when he died in his 90s, it wasn't even because of that. So he went his entire life with the exact same condition I did. However, when I was about 29, I was working at a job where I had to travel around. We had a sales kind of trip that we had to do. And I was out, partying with a lot of the suppliers and maybe some of the customers. We hit, 3 states and 5 cities in like 10 days. And it was intense, as you can imagine. And at the end of it, I couldn't breathe. I got home, and it takes a lot for me to go to a hospital. And I felt like I had 500 pounds of weight on my chest. So I went to the ER, and it turned out they misdiagnosed it as a heart attack. And then they insisted that I'd been doing Coke, because I guess Coke also gives the same EKG as a heart attack does. And I said, I've never touched a drug, but I've been on Red Bull vodkas for 10 days pretty intensely. And what it turned out to be was this infection in the lining of the heart, pericarditis, at 29 years old. And I really never felt like I came back from that. I felt like my heart took a real backslide at that point and never quite came back. And then fast forward to age 34, I'm doing this 2 to 3 hours sleep a night for a few years. And I really think that the lack of sleep probably did more damage than what perhaps the drinking was at that point in life. But so long-winded answer, but basically it was something started that I think would have been very manageable by itself. But my destructive habits on top of that are I think what really did it in and put it in a bad place. Right.
Well, so thanks. I realize that was a bit personal, but there's a reason I asked, and we'll come back to that in a little while. It has to do with the story that you tell in your film. But first, why don't we talk about that ride? So in my introduction to listeners, they will have learned that you rode from the Pacific Ocean to the beach in Florida in 33 hours and 10 minutes, which was then a record, and I think it still is a record, right?
Far as I know, I had one person reach out to me about a year or two after it, and he had a smaller bike, and he said, I'm thinking about doing this. And I said, knock yourself out, pal. I'm happy to answer any questions. And, we messaged back and forth, and about a month or two later, he said, you know what, I did the math. There's no way in hell I can even touch what you did. And I said, I encourage you to try, but there's a reason it was tough,
Yeah. Yeah, there's just some details of that whole thing etched in my brain that absolutely support what you're saying. What on earth possessed you to do this? Now, you had done all kinds of stuff that has to do with going fast. I know you'd been to the Texas Mile and things like that. So in a sense, it's not surprising you would escalate like this. But this seems really extreme. What got this idea in your head?
Well, as an addict, one thing I've learned is that addicts are never healed. It's a factor of your personality. And what we tend to do is we find new addictions and we hope they're less destructive than the last. So that's why Alice Cooper went from vomiting blood every morning on too much Budweiser and his morning beer to playing golf, right? That's his new addiction. It's less destructive. And so that's just a thing in the brain that needs more of these things that we enjoy. And after going through the heart surgery, I cut back on the drinking. I didn't touch a drop for a year. And then when I did, it was very moderate. I really realized that I had to get a handle on it. And so I cut back on that. But as an addict, when you quit one thing, then you need something else. That's why a lot of people that quit smoking end up gaining 30 pounds because now they're stuffing their face with burgers instead of cigarettes, right? And so in trying to fill that gap, that's when about that time I got the BMW, I'm building the chopper and stuff. And just going out in that hill country on the crotch rocket and ripping through there, it's just that intensity, but you're out in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody around. It's just you and the machine and open road and some nice scenery. And you get that little rush. So you go through the work week and you go through day in and day out doing the chores and going to work and stuff. And then you start living for those little moments of, getting out on the bike and able to, or like turning wrenches on it or something. And then you start getting more and you start going faster. And every time you take the bike out, you're doing, today I hit 120, tomorrow, next week I get 140, the next week I get 150, and you just keep pushing it. And so the way I looked at it is I need something to sort of level me off for a while to just kind of let me reset, relax, and enjoy what I've got here, because I have a great life. Most people would, really like to have my life, and I don't want to screw it up by doing something stupid. So how can I satisfy this demon in me, right? And about that time, I read the book by Alex Roy about him breaking the cross-country record in the car that time, and then watched the movie. And the whole way through both of them, all I'm thinking is, I got to do something like this. Like, this is big. This is something, that will satisfy me for a while. And I knew that I wasn't going to, I couldn't compete with what he was doing with the spotter plane and 3 people in the car and all this stuff. And I thought, I'm a bike guy and I've got 2 big assets. It's balls and brains. And that's what it would take to do this on a bike. And so that's where I can compete. And so, that's kind of what I decided. And I thought about, the whole cross country, and I was like, well, the Cadillac, I'd be stopping for gas every 20 minutes. It's comfy, but that wouldn't really be practical. And, but then the chopper, it's like, I love the chopper, but that's not really the most practical vehicle for it either. And I thought, that BMW, it's not exactly a comfy cruiser, but it's fast, it's reliable, it's solid, it gets good mileage, 45 plus miles a gallon. I mean, that's the machine for me. And so that's kind of where the inception of it really happened.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to ask about the bike, because it seems on the surface obvious that a bike that's built for speed would be perfect for the job, but it's still a sport bike.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a 2010 S1000RR. I think officially BMW said it was 190 horsepower at the crank, but everybody knew BMW was sandbagging. I've seen dyno runs that, put it at 185 at the rear wheel. I mean, the thing is a missile. Whatever else it is, it's a missile. And so I was going to ask you, why was it the right tool for the job? Maybe you've answered that, but was there more to it?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to go out and buy a new vehicle for it. I already had this stable of several toys, right? And so I didn't want to buy something new. And as I thought about it, I'm like, it's reliable, it's fast. The mileage is one of the big things on it. I've ridden that thing. I think by that point I'd already done my 1,000-mile straight run from Texas to Colorado and then rode the mountains. And, I was seeing, in the 40s for mileage. And then, of course, I modified it, and I made it even better. But the bike just felt good to me. It felt solid. I trusted it, which is a big thing. It had enough modern technology. It had the anti-lock brakes if I needed them. It had traction control and other stuff, which honestly I didn't want when I bought the bike. I told them to keep all their fancy electronics and just give me the raw bike. And they said, too bad, we get one more. You want it or not? And I took it. And the first time I was doing, actually Sunshine was on the back. The first day I got the rev limiter off of it. And so I could finally go above 7,000. And we were out in the middle of nowhere and I cracked it through first gear. And when I shifted into second and dumped the clutch, I could see the ground getting further away. And I was like, uh-oh. And all of a sudden I saw the little orange lights flickering saying, I'm taking over because you're an idiot. And it set us down at, 100 plus, just smooth as silk. And so that was kind of me becoming a believer in the technology at that point.
Yeah.
But, those are some of the main reasons. Like I said, the Cadillac wasn't the right choice. The Chopper, the Sportster, they're cool bikes in that, but for doing just a ground speed missile type event, that BMW is the best thing I had for an option.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. And it's a looker too. So I hope people are going to watch your film and see this for themselves, but just to whet their appetite, do you want to talk a bit more about some of the modifications you made? I think when you sent me the email introducing yourself, the line that caught my eye was thermal imaging night vision. I thought, this guy's special.
Yeah, special kind of crazy, right? So the thing I started looking at with it was, okay, here's my base bike. What do I need to do? And some of the things were, it's much easier to gear a bike than a car, and I can throw different sprockets on it. So I re-geared it to do over 100 in first gear, and that gave me a little bit better mileage. I knew fuel stops were going to be a challenge. That's what was going to kill your time because you're pulling over. You're going to spend at least 20 plus minutes, if not 30, even just gassing and going because you got to get off the interstate and everything. So I found, I looked at different options. I ended up finding a 5-gallon tank to mount to the rear of the bike. And then I plumbed it and everything to go up to the main tank so I could refuel from the rear tank in flight. I just put the throttle lock on at 80, 90, 100, whatever I was doing, and just, mess with the throttle or the gas valves and get it to fill up. The thermal vision. So riding back from Colorado is when I was doing about $120 down some old back road and wherever between here and there. And I saw myself miss a carcass by less than a foot. And I thought, wow, if I'd been just a few inches over, I'd be laying out here with Bambi right now. And it was kind of an eye opener. So when I started thinking about the cross country, I looked around and I explored like a night vision, which was my go-to. And, in researching it, I realized that was a poor choice for what I wanted because night vision is going to blind you with the oncoming cars. And what I really needed is something that, was going to be immune to that. So the thermal vision is what I finally found was the right option. And I mounted it in the Cadillac first and took that to Colorado and back as kind of a test run, make sure that I liked the technology and everything. And then I switched that over to the BMW and, I designed some brackets that I had 3D printed so I could mount it, but it's pretty intense when you're doing, mid 100s range and you're staring at a screen on your tank instead of where you're going. It's, takes a little bit more faith than I'm known for. That's for sure.
That's for sure. Wow. Speaking about preparation, I thought your solution for kind of ground support was brilliant, and so 21st century, because it was like one dude plus the internet, and he was. It appeared to me anyway that he was just ahead of you all the time, with traffic and where fuel stops were and all that stuff. And I thought that was a striking piece of foresight that I thought was pretty cool, and it speaks a lot about your level of preparation for this thing, that it wasn't impulsive. Do you want to talk about that and any other sort of groundwork you laid in preparation for doing this? What did you do to mitigate risk and make sure you were going to win?
Yeah, sure. So definitely with Tanford, having him set up as my home base, he's somebody that's always been like, he's an engineer too. And so he's always enjoyed things like cannonballs and stuff like that and technology. So we just made a spreadsheet, because the thing I didn't want to end up happening is fail the mission because I got stuck between two cities in the middle of BFE nowhere and ran out of gas, right? And so the main thing I needed him for is, I need you to tell me, okay, I've used this much gas, my light's coming on, I fill up with the rear tank, estimate where I'm going to run out so we can be prepared. I still almost got stuck in the middle of somewhere, but that was a big one. Some of the other things, not only the prep of the bike, of course, but, looking at ergonomics and everything, but I actually generated and I filed, a patent pending I have on this process, but I called it a mitigation for marginal areas of performance, I think. And what I tried to do is look at the system, right, as a human on a machine. And we all know the human is always the weak link, right? A human is always going to fail before the machine. Well, almost always, right? Not my old shovelhead, but generally the human will fail first.
Right.
But going through that, I developed this kind of risk analysis process in how you look at the human and you mitigate those risks. So I'd look at something and say, okay, I'm going to have to go to the bathroom. That's a problem because I don't want to have to pull over and waste time at a gas stop. So I used a condom catheter. And it's, I need to hydrate somehow. How do I do that? So I wore a Camelback and had, fluids able to drink, through a hose, the Camelback attachment into my helmet. And you just look at every little part that could fail on me, and then you mitigate that as best you can so that you get the most use out of what that machine's capable of without me dragging it down, right? And work better as a system instead of a weak link that's like an anchor for this awesome piece of technology.
Right.
And so I actually presented that process at a military health conference in Lauderdale one year or two, and just had a poster for, the human performance aspects of it and stuff. So I figured I'm going to do silly stuff. Maybe somebody can benefit from it. Other kinds of planning that I did, nothing really happened by accident. Things like the cameras. I had a camera on my chest and I had a camera on the dash, but I purposely had two of them because I knew that if I would get pulled over, I was going to have to pull the chip from the dash cam and smash it to destroy the evidence, because there would probably be video of me doing too high of a speed. And then that way I would still have backup footage on my chest cam. Things like going west to east. It made sense because I have a really good friend that I have a good old college roommate, Hollywood, in San Diego as well, but I have a good friend in Florida that's a bike guy, and Jacksonville. And so it made sense to go west to east in that way. But I also knew that night is where I was going to be able to fly, because with my thermal vision, less traffic, my radar and all that, that's where I could really open it up and go. And driving west to east gave me a little bit more dark hours going against the sun versus if I would have gone the other way. We looked at seasons, right? I did the ride in April. And the reason for that is winter's too cold, summer's too damn hot, and that leaves spring and fall. But what happens in the South in fall? You got a ton of deer out trying to kill you, and you got hurricanes trying to kill you. So that's why I chose April. That was like the ideal from not only a temperature, but just general conditions standpoint.
Right.
So there's very little that happened by accident. It was, I spent about 9 months planning this. And honestly, at the end of it, you make it and you're like, yeah, that actually worked pretty slick. Like, I'm actually somewhat impressed with something. The worst thing that happened was the phone chip died, in Florida or whatever.
Right.
But for the most part, it actually went about as smooth as you could ask for, because there's so much that can go wrong in that. You could get a flat tire, you could break a chain, you could, whatever. There's 100 things that can go wrong, and there's a very narrow path of success that I was able to find.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And that was clear. I mean, I think I seem to recall there was like one near miss with law enforcement that, but otherwise the impression certainly I got from the film was that it went very smoothly. It's funny you mentioned riding at night. That's actually what I picture. If I imagine myself, in your shoes for that ride, I don't think about, lane splitting my way out of Southern California traffic, which is how the film begins, which is harrowing enough. But for some reason, what I picture is an empty highway at night, and so I'm kind of wondering what's going on in your head in those moments. So you're pretty accustomed to speed, and by then you're accustomed to the speed you're doing. There's not much to look at, just a tunnel of light and your instruments, and I guess your thermal imaging system. Where do you go in your head? I mean, 33 hours isn't a long time, but it is a long time. What's going on inside your helmet?
It really went faster than a guy would think. And so the first night period that I had was going from, I suppose it was getting dark by the time I was in, what would it have been? I suppose Arizona through kind of West Texas was the nighttime, right? And that's where, so having grown up in Iowa, there was many nights that I'd be cruising home at 2 a.m. from Cedar Falls or Ames or Des Moines or something on my old Harley or in the Cougar, and just getting home as fast as I can. And I got to be pretty good. And I, hunted some, as a kid with dad and stuff. So I fortunately had the ability to identify animals, because in Iowa, deer are everywhere up there, right? And they're big ones. And so you have to, if you're going to survive driving, high speeds at night, you're going to have to learn how to see animals and always be prepared and ready to brake and avoid them. And so even back here in Texas, I'd gone riding with one guy one time. We both took our bikes out. And when we pulled up to a stop sign or for breakfast or something, he said, "What did you keep pointing out into the off to the side?" And I said, "Well, I was pointing at the deer to make sure you saw them so that you'd be, slow down and get ready in case they jumped out." And he looks at me and goes, "How in the hell did you see those deer?" He said, "I never saw a single one of those." And I said, "Then you shouldn't be riding at night, because that's a basic survival skill."
That's for sure.
Now, ironically, I've killed 3 deer in the last 2 years. I mean, I did good for a long time, but my luck ran out, and I've got 3 in the last 2 years I've hit. But anyway, all that aside, going through the night like that, you have to stay. It's tough because you're tired, but you're excited. So you're on an adrenaline high, which is great. That's going to help keep you moving, but you just have to make sure that you're focused. And I try to challenge my brain with figuring out how many miles I had and what's my mileage right now. And, you just find yourself thinking about what if and preparing, and it's almost completely consumed by that ride. There's very little that you can think about besides the sheer excitement of what you're doing, and trying to make sure that you're constantly thinking your way out of anything that might go wrong, and avoiding wrecks. You're scanning, just like they teach in driver's ed, always be scanning, right? Don't just stare at the road and zone out. And between having the radar detector and the FLIR screen and just scanning the horizon, you go by trucks, you slow down, kind of have my system. And that was a pretty alert, proper way to go through the night. Now, going through Western Florida, when I was going through my second night, that was a lot tougher. I was really starting to fade then. And I remember at one point, and I kind of touch on this in the movie a little bit, there was a point where I was going around this truck, had the big stomper wheels on it, tires on it. And I was going around this truck. And in my mind, I realized that I was picturing sort of an oval type track through the trees and this forest. And I remember thinking, I wonder if this guy's going to be on my team next round, or if I'll have someone else on my team. And the other part of my brain realized that I was stuck between a dream and reality kind of coexisting. And for nobody that's ever experienced it, it's hard to explain, but that's the best way I can say it is you're having a dream at the same time that you're awake and experiencing reality. And it's a really freaky thing to experience that once you get in the, 25 to 30 hours without sleep, it happens. I've experienced it before, and it's weird, but it's extra scary when you're doing 120 down an open interstate. You can't see where you're going, right? And so it's almost like you get two voices in your brain, and one is freaking out because it's nervous that, you think you're in a dream while you're doing all this. And it kind of takes the other part to sit there and say, calm down. You're on I-10. You're heading east to the water. All you got to do is keep driving until you hit water. That's all you got to do. Don't do something stupid like turn around and go back west. You're not on a round track. This guy, you don't know him. Just keep driving and doing your thing. You've got your system. Trust and believe in yourself that you're doing what you got to do, and just keep doing it. And eventually the coexistence two states kind of blended back to reality. And I was still shaken because it was cold and I was malnourished and I was, tired and everything else. And you start getting this paranoia that there's everything you see move is, a deer ready to get you or a cop going to arrest you or something. Right. And it really was a touch and go for a lot of that part. And that's a long stretch of I-10 to the point where when I went through Tallahassee, I stopped for gas because I had no idea how far Tallahassee was from Jacksonville anymore. I lived in that state for 6 years. I'd made the drive before, and I completely forgot how far it was, and my phone chip was dead, so I couldn't tell. And I was like, well, I better stop for gas because I have no idea where I really am. And that was pretty intense.
Yeah, I can imagine, because on top of that, I think you would have to have been dehydrated, and I don't think you'd had much to eat, so blood sugar and all that stuff. That's a remarkable amount of mental toughness. It's funny, I was going to ask you what the low point was, because, I have to believe that the high point of the trip was the beach in Jacksonville. But it sounds like the low point was kind of right before that. Is that true, or were there other moments that were kind of low?
So for low points, the part where I was getting confused and thought I was in a dream was a really tough section of road. That was a hard thing to grip. The other low point, if I had to identify one, is having a cop come in behind me as I was ready to take that home stretch that in Jacksonville towards the beach, because there was nobody else on the road.
Right.
And the radar went off, and I'm like, I was so planned to be like popped out across that stretch. And I'm like, I don't dare. Like, how dumb would it be to get pulled over right before you finish, So that was kind of a low. As far as the high point, it's kind of anticlimactic almost. When you pull into the beach, you're just so fried. It's like the heroin addict with the blood in the palm, and passing out and the needle in their arm. It's like I spent everything I had, which is what I wanted to do, and that's the right way to do it. But it was almost more exciting when I first just started leaving, because it's kind of fun dipping in and out of cars. I'd never really done lane changing before, lane splitting.
Right.
And I think there was some more exciting, like when my buddies in Louisiana were waiting on the side of the road to kind of cheer me going by. That was, you kind of feed on that energy and kind of get yourself, catch your second wind and stuff. So you have those little moments along the way when you can really just hammer it, and that kind of brings you back to life. But yeah, it's a long time to sit still in one position for sure. You're going to kind of, get a little bit worn out doing it, but it's a day and a half total, right? It was under 36 hours total. So that's not long to suffer.
Still, I'm getting a little cranky after 2 hours on my sport bike. So, I've got a few years on you, but just back to the bike for a second. I have to say, for some reason, I chuckled at that scene towards the end when you went to the beach in the morning, and then you just got back on the bike and fired it up and rode it off like nothing happened. And I'm looking at that thing and I'm going, this motorcycle just came back from space. Like, how is it possible that it's just normal now? It seemed like that thing performed incredibly well. It was like the one thing that didn't break. And so I guess my long question is, did you feel somehow bonded with it when it was over? I know you still have it, or was it just a machine? Like, how did that relationship change, if I can call it that?
Yeah, it's absolutely that. It was bizarre because I got home. I wasn't home. I got to my buddy's place at, say, what was it, like 5 a.m. or something, right? And I think I was so just jacked up and just a mess that I barely slept for 2 hours. I got up a couple hours later and rode out to the beach on it. And, it almost becomes an extension of you at that point. Like, it's so comfortable, not comfortable, but familiar maybe is a better word, right?
Yeah.
And, it's me and my bike. Like, that's just something that, fits. And you've built this experience with it. I went through a really mess for the last few years with that bike because I unfortunately trusted somebody that claimed to be a mechanic and thought they knew more than BMW, and they cost me a lot of time and money. But I could have easily said, I'm scrapping the bike. I can't do this. It's not worth it. I'm just going to upgrade or something. But it's just like you say, it's a relationship, and you love that machine, and you've been through all those experiences together. And I'd rather have that thing sitting in my living room than see it go. And so I've got it back, and it's running, and upgraded it with an 18 engine and electronics. And now it's great. And I stripped all the paint off the tank and polished it to a mirror shine, and it's got carbon fiber, everything, and titanium. And I love the machine, but you really do. And I think the Harley was the thing that kind of built that into me. And I felt really guilty when I sold it. After 9.5 years of my very formative life, right? From age 19 to, 28, 9, whatever, we'd been through a lot together. I went through my hernia surgery when I first got it, and rode down to the Metallica concert on it, and then, all had it through college and everything, and all the times in Texas with it. And it was hard to get rid of it. It was really like, I felt worse about getting rid of that bike than I did getting divorced. Like, it's because you go through those experiences, right? Whether it's with a person or with a machine, the more experiences you go through, that bond really does become tighter. And when you do something like break a record on it, that's part of you now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, I get that. I think I would feel the same way. I feel like I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. You talked earlier about one of the reasons you did this being, a desire to do something so big that it would kind of scratch the itch for a long time. Did it? Did you, at any point after this, did you feel it's enough now, or is that itch still there?
It was a strange period of time after that. And, so when I finished the ride, I was spent, right? Like, the bike, it took its time coming back from Florida. I had to be shipped and everything, and all that was fine, and I just flew back, and, eventually it came back, and I started tearing the gas tank off and all that, and started doing my rides again, a little bit here and there. But it really did, just to use your words, scratch the itch for a long time. And then what happened is, Sunshine, my girlfriend in the movie, shortly after the ride, she was diagnosed with cancer. And that became, the only thing I could focus on was taking care of her for her last few months. And so that basically consumed me from that point forward. And then once, after losing her, that's the worst thing I can imagine going through. And that's just dealing with, how do I get back to being myself, or some version of it, took a long time. And so I did release the book the next April, after the year statute of limitations. And I was in one of those kind of positions where I easily could have said, forget it. I can't deal with this. But I kind of felt like it was important because I didn't ever want to resent what happened by shorting myself of something that I did that, like she wouldn't have wanted me to short myself of that accomplishment, right? Like I should still be, it was hard, but I still wanted to celebrate the accomplishment. And, in the book, it's got parts of our lives together, right? And even with the movie and the soundtrack that I did and everything, all those things, those projects are, to me, they're therapeutic because they're ways that I can sort of remember that time of life, honor that. And if you think about it, the movie, for in 82 minutes, it covers the very highest and the very lowest events of my life in that short period. And so eventually, after losing her, I had to be very careful because I know myself. And when you're in a happy mood, sometimes these kind of addictions can be mood enhancers, right? Like we all know that if you're in a bad mood, don't drink because it puts you in a worse mood. If you're in a good mood, fine, because you'll get in a better mood.
Right.
But with something like loss, your recklessness becomes more destructive than just having fun. And I know that about myself. And so I didn't even get on a bike for probably 6 months or whatever after that. Or go drive fast in the hill country or any of that stuff, because I had to try to get my mind in a better mindset where I could enjoy those things again, but in a better way, not in a destructive way.
Right.
If that makes sense. So a lot of the last few years have been, working with, like I said, between the book and then deciding, hey, this movie would be better with a soundtrack. I'll write and record an album, even though I'm a horrible singer, as you noticed in the movie, but I'm happy with the guitar parts and the lyrics. And at the end of the day, I can say I did the whole thing, right? I planned it out. I did the ride. I made the book. I wrote the book. I wrote the soundtrack, recorded it, did the movie, all the editing. And, it's really the kind of pinnacle of my life, right? Is everything that I've done and would like to leave behind as a message or whatever you want to say is contained in that movie.
Right. Yeah, I get that impression. And actually, I want to ask you a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Well, first of all, condolences for the loss of Sunshine. That was terrible. And I thought you treated her character, beautifully in the film. And I totally got the impression that she supported you every step of the way. So this is an appropriate tribute. I think, there's that self-awareness again of yours. So maybe just in that vein, reflecting on that ride now, I'm wondering about a couple of things that sort of have to do with what makes you tick, if you like. The first one has to do with transgression. I guess the sort of thrill of breaking rules. I smiled in the film. You show yourself taking delivery of that BMW and then painting flames on it. Which would have made, most BMW owners would have kittens at this, the sight of it, and how you relished that, and how you were, you knew it would freak out the purist. And I heard you say in the podcast interview I mentioned earlier that part of the reason this film took so long was because you had to wait out the legal statute of limitations. I think you actually just mentioned that a minute ago too. So I'm kind of wondering, in the spirit of kind of exploring adrenaline addiction, is being an outlaw part of the recipe? Is being an outlaw part of the recipe for that adrenaline rush for you?
I think to me, they're a little bit, well, I'm trying to think. That's a good question. So one part of me says that they're separate because the adrenaline rush that you get from ripping down a runway or whatever it is, right? That's a feeling that you get at that time from the sheer speed of it. But I'd be remiss if I didn't admit that, yes, part of the excitement, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to have excitement without fear, right? And part of that excitement is because it's dangerous. And, up until hitting 3 deer in the last couple of years before that was part of the excitement is, I would do ridiculous speeds through the back roads, pitch black. It's stupid enough to do that when it's daylight. You can see around the curve a little bit. You still got blind hills and everything else. And the outlaw part of it, I'm not sure how to qualify that, because there's not, like, when I see the kind of, I don't want to get too much into this topic, but when I see the behavior that happened last year where people are, burning stuff down and hurting people, and just the kind of behavior like that, I have zero tolerance for that kind of stuff, because that's just not how you function in society. But that said, someone could also argue with me and say, well, you shouldn't be breaking 55 speed limit, because that's not how you function in society. But I'm pretty conscious about how I satisfy my urges that way. If you'll notice in the film, when I went around a semi, I would always slow down to something within, say, 20 mile an hour of them, go around. I would use my blinkers. I would wave, make sure that I was being a courteous driver, and then I'd blast on my way. I wasn't, being obnoxious or passing people on entrance ramps or stuff like that. I was driving fast, but I always try to be pretty conscious about, I don't mind doing things that might hurt me. It's when you start doing things that are going to hurt others that now it's more of a decency thing, I guess.
Right.
And so, I'm all for pushing my limits and seeing what I can get away with. And I tend to do that most of my life. But ultimately, I feel like the main person I've ever risked is myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good answer, and I think a legitimate distinction. But because I remember sort of watching a film, and you talked at the very beginning of this conversation about stereotypes, and I started to get the impression after watching you and listening to you for a while that you were like a good guy who looked like a bad guy, and I thought that was interesting. At least from my nice, safe, middle-aged perspective. So I kind of I was curious about what this what the role of transgression was in all this. The second question I wanted to ask about your nature has to do with control. I think we touched a bit on this earlier. So in some ways, you've taken incredible risks, but in some ways, you really haven't. I mean, you mentioned you have an engineering degree. You're a total control freak about your machines, almost like a pilot. You like to do everything yourself. Even the film you wrote, narrated, edited, and scored. Your logistical preparation for the ride was, pretty impressive considering, the resources available. So I'm wondering how you square that with the desire to keep going until something breaks. Is this part of the rush too, or is this some kind of yin to the yang of chasing the next fix? I'm just wondering how you. I realize I'm probably cornering you a bit here. I hope you don't mind, but I'm curious to know what you think about that.
No, I don't. In fact, I always like to learn more about my own strangeness, and that's a question to kind of dig in. And, I've had similar thoughts, but it's interesting the way that you worded it. I think without a doubt, I've always been an extremist, and your extremes can go one way or the other. And sometimes they counter each other. So for example, at one point when I had that 911 Turbo back in 2002 or so, I was living on $3 a day for food. I was basically had an egg and a hash brown patty in the morning and a peanut butter and jelly and a loser sandwich and maybe a cheap pork chop and a baked potato at night, right?
And
so I was literally living on
a car
$3 a day in food.
Right. And a car that'll hit 60 in 2.8 seconds.
Yeah. And I had a $730 a month car payment. Yeah, it was damn near as much as my mortgage, and ridiculous, right? But so if you see one part of me, you would say, wow, he's a tight ass, man, $3 for food. He won't even go out and buy a decent meal or have lunch with his buddies. But I've always kind of looked at it as I want to splurge where I enjoy it, but there's no value to me in using 3 times the shampoo I need in the shower, or there's no value to, wearing a $200 tie or shirt if I don't have to, if I can get by with the Aero ones or something. So what I tend to do is find an extreme in almost anything. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that I don't do well in the gray. I've never really been good at moderation. I don't like ambiguity. And it's easier for me to just say, I don't do drugs versus somebody say, wait a minute, I saw you doing weed. What about why don't you try coke? Because then I get caught in the gray and I get frustrated with what's the right answers, right? Mm. And so there's a lot of things, and you're right, like absolutely a control freak. And that OCD about everything has to be perfect. And I can't hire somebody to edit my movie. I have to do it myself because only I can do this right. And some of that has really come because there's times in my life that I've paid somebody to do something and they have severely disappointed me multiple times over. And so the more I go through life and I keep seeing people not, do what they're supposed to and fail after I paid them to do something, I just get more of a control freak because I just have less faith in people doing what they're supposed to. And it's not everybody. There's some people that do an awesome job at what they should, but the disappointments make it hard to swallow. And so I think it may be almost like you say, the yin and the yang, right? Like for most of my day job, I have to control every detail I can. In most of my life, I have to control that I don't know, like the salsa and the sour cream are in exactly this order. And I number the groceries when they get delivered so that I don't use one thing too soon before the other. I mean, I'm, almost maniacal about some of this stuff. And if I take something apart in the garage, it better be every screw and bolt exactly like I laid it out so that it goes right back together perfectly. And maybe that's why something like letting go, with speed is almost a way to balance that, right? Because everything requires balance of some kind. And so maybe that's just my way of being not in control, and that balances the extremity of the other. And I think, to be honest, with drinking, when I was drinking heavy in my younger years, that was a big part of it is, it was like, reading the first page of a book and then flipping to the last page and trying to figure out what happened between. And, it's kind of scary looking back now, but that's what we did. And it was sort of that let go. And then starting again on Monday, I'm up at 6:30 having breakfast, going to my 8 o'clock classes, getting those done and, cranking out a workout and whatever else. So, it might just be me trying to achieve some balance in all the extremes. I can't find a gray, like there's no 0.5s in my life. I've got a whole lot of ones and zeros, and they might average to 0.5, but there's no 0.5s individually.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. That actually makes a funny kind of sense. And it makes me wonder about something. You at one point early in your film said, "Why can't I be happy with a great life?" And I'm wondering what you meant by that. And I wonder whether you have an answer now that you didn't have then.
Yeah, at the time, that the scene you're talking about is where I rode the chopper out to the beach, and the bike was on its way to Florida. And I was just kind of, going out there to enjoy a sunrise over the water and, ride the chopper and just kind of do a little, one of the preparation aspects of this whole ride is you're literally putting yourself in a mindset of it's okay if you crash and die. But if you end up living through it and you screwed up this thing and you didn't make it fast enough, that's failure at the worst level. And the only thing worse than that would have been if I pulled over to take a nap and failed that way because I was just weak. I would look at that as a weakness, right? If I would have had to stop and take a nap because I was too tired or whatever, that would have been the worst outcome possible.
Right.
So you've gone through a little bit of a mental transformation and reprogramming yourself. And there's a point actually where Sunshine looked over at me. We were driving somewhere and she said, "Hey, how about if we take a little picture of, and from the movie, just a bubbly personality, right?" She's like, "Well, how about if we take a picture of Baron and me and we tape it to your tank so you can, think of us as you're riding?" And before she could even finish, I said, "No." And she said, "Well, what would be wrong with that?" I said, "Because if I'm thinking about what I have to lose, I won't do what I have to win."
Wow.
And she looked at me and I said, I know that sounds really messed up, but I said, I can't be doing that. I can't be distracted and worry. I have to just put my head in and just go. And that's all. I just know myself well enough to know that's what I have to do. So, it's a matter of, sitting at the beach, thinking about my life. I've been very lucky in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, I've got a bad heart, but that's because I did it to myself. Was fortunate enough to be intelligent enough to get through school and get decent jobs and that. And the setbacks I've had have been more self-induced than, by anything else. But, my life at that time, it's like I have a good job. I live in a great place. I've got a girlfriend. We've got our dog. We've got our cars. I've got my bikes, guitars, you name it. I've got everything a person could want in life. Why can't I just be satisfied with that? Why can't I just enjoy it and be happy? And what is it that just makes me go do this? Like, it's very possible I could have ended up in jail in that ride. It's possible I could have crashed and died in that ride. And to sit there and say, I've got this awesome life, it's just me questioning the human condition a little bit, especially my condition. And what is it that makes it hard for me to just sit and be happy with what I have? But that's just never been me. I've never wanted the C's. I've wanted the A's. I've never wanted to be normal. There's, and I've tried to get, you asked if, is it different now? I will say that I've tried to get better in the last few years, at least, much better about appreciating what I have. And it doesn't mean that I don't still try to maximize my life and do everything I can. And I still fight a balance of, geez, if I get up at 2 a.m. and I work on this, I can get that bike put back together and then go for a ride and do this. And I still go through those little things and try to balance them. But what I don't want to be doing is always chasing the next thing. And I think where I saw it was in the corporate world, where you'd see people that no matter what they had, they always complained, I'm not making enough money. I'm not promoted enough. I'm not doing this. And I get wanting the sense of accomplishment, but when that's all they care about, they're never happy where they are now. And that's one thing that I've really tried to do is enjoy the now. And that's something I learned with Sunshine, right? Because she was always very much of a, be happy with where you are and stuff. And that's one of the things that I like to think I learned. But you got to enjoy the moment, whether you're working in the garage or, exercising or whatever, but be very aware of what you're doing and enjoy it. And I think that helps a person be happier than always wishing they had something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And I got that impression from Sunshine too. And so in the film, you let us know that she's passed away in a very sudden moment. The music stops, the edit is abrupt, and we find out very suddenly that you've lost her. And you say in the film, nature commands a cruel balance. And it felt to me like you were taking some of this on yourself somehow. I hope that's not too personal. We don't know each other, but that was the feeling I got, was that you were seeing this as somehow a price you had to pay, and obviously that's not true. So what's going on there? Does that got something to do with the balance that you've been talking about, or where did that thought come from?
Yeah, so that's the way that I looked at the movie is, I stitched a lot of it together, right? I had this footage and I wanted it to follow as close to the book as I could, right? Because, that to me is just something that annoys me. If I actually do read a book and then the movie doesn't match, I get annoyed. So I wanted to try to make it match. And in the book, it stops, after the ride. But in the movie, when I made it, now with this new information, right, that hadn't happened when I released, well, it happened, but it wasn't in the book. I really thought hard about that. And I thought, I want it to match the book, but to me, it's such a pivotal point of my life, even though it happens after the ride. And I felt like it's part of my story, right? Like that's part of the story is this happened.
Yeah, of course.
And I didn't want the movie to end. And this is where you really get stuck as somewhat of an, I guess I'll use the term loosely, an artist, is you're trying to think about how other people will see it, but you also have to make sure that you're being very genuine. To me, that's very important, is to be genuine and real about what happened. And so I didn't want to dwell on it and have the people walk away from it feeling low, right? You don't want to have people walk out of it and be like, oh my God, what a downer of a movie. So I chose to implement it the way I did and the way that I did it, as you mentioned, it's very abrupt. And I did that on purpose because that's how it hit me, right? It was a very abrupt thing that happened, even though it spreads time, but it's like, it hits you like a brick wall. And so I tried to capture the way that it kind of hit me without dwelling on it. And the whole nature commands cruel balance. What I really meant with that is I have just come off the highest of highs I can imagine in becoming the best in the world at what I love to do. And then right there behind it is a smackdown, for if I'm being selfish about all of a sudden, then there's this loss that hit me. And I think back to a good friend of mine in college had told me, he was, a little bit older, but going back to school. And he said, there are people that are so monotone in life and they've not been through anything. And he said, you can't appreciate the high highs without the low lows. And it's one of those things that you kind of hear, when you're younger, and it sticks. It's one of them things that just sticks in the back of your head. And, I've been through plenty in life, highs and lows, but it just seems so poetically ridiculous, I guess, to have achieved the biggest accomplishment of my life. And then right behind it, lose the thing most important to me. And you're right. It's not like it's my fault, but it was really, it's hard not to have dark thoughts in a situation like that. It's hard not to be like, geez, am I being punished for some, my past or, it's just your brain goes in some dark places in something like that because it's not expected. It's, something so awful to somebody so amazing. And I think that's part of people's looking for answers, or like, if I had some reason that I could understand this, but there's just no reason for it. And I think you reach a little bit, and sometimes you reach into a dark place.
Yeah, sure, of course. And then you kind of fight your way out of it. Towards the very end, you say, I'm not running from death, I'm chasing it. Not in exactly those words, but something like that.
Yeah.
As if it was a kind of revelation. So the feeling of it was, okay, I'm not going to let this, I'm not going to stop fighting the fight. But it also felt like a discovery to you, at least in the way that you delivered the line. What did you mean by that?
So it can mean a couple things. It's interesting, the perspective that you put on it, that I'm not going to, run and be and hide from it. And that's definitely, I think that's definitely an undertone. The thing that I was, I guess, experiencing when I wrote that part of it, and I was talking to my cousin, and we talked about something like just, we've evaded the Reaper how many times or whatever. And in talking to him, I just said, you know what? And I said, maybe we're not running from him. Maybe we're chasing him. And he's like, that's an interesting way to put it. And it kind of stuck in me a little bit. And that's where I thought that's kind of to me, I like the line and the way I use it there, because it can mean a couple different things, right? Like it's definitely like, I don't want to be afraid of stuff. I want to live life as I have it, like you mentioned, right? That's definitely a way that it can mean. But in some ways, there became a different appetite for stuff like that after the loss. And that was, you got to remember at this time, when I was doing this, it was still fairly recent after, it all happened, but there's a different appetite for the speed and stuff. And in some ways, I hate to say it, but it almost comes with some sort of an apathy or a tempting of fate or whatever you want to say. And it's, like I've gotten away with this much. I've survived this long. You've thrown everything else at me. It's kind of tempting fate. Like, what's next? Like, I'll push you as far as you want to go with this. And it becomes almost some kind of a weird challenge to physics, logic, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
You get this arrogance of I can't be hurt. I've survived this much. What's next? And I think that even, I've over the years as time has passed, I've gotten better at when I'm writing. I'm trying to really not be, angry at the time I'm writing, but really enjoying it and just having fun with it and stuff, and not be, dark about it. But I tell you what, I center punched a deer on the Aprilia a couple of years ago in the fall, or whenever that was, September. And I came around full speed while I was coming around a curve in the dark, 6 a.m. And I came out of the curve, straightened out, cracked the throttle wide open. And I'm pretty good at looking for animals, but that thing, I didn't see anything until he was hanging mid jump right in front of my headlight. And I was doing, we'll say, a spirited pace, and center punched that thing. It killed the deer. I lost control. The bike went flying down the highway. I went ragdolling. I landed on the shoulder and watched my bike come to a slide. I think it was about 85 yards from where we impacted the deer. And I got up, picked the bike up, had one blinker left, so I put that on so I wouldn't get run over from someone behind me. Limped back to town about 25 mile an hour on it and totaled the bike. The deer was dead. It was a 7-point buck, and damn near wore through the back of my leathers, ruined the helmet. The titanium glove knuckles were ruined. And, that's a fatal wreck 99 times out of 100 to center punch a deer. And I was in Austin at the bars that afternoon, just...
Yeah.
He's only got to win once. I've won all these times, but he's only got to catch you once.
Yeah. A person could take the view that the universe just isn't done with you yet. But I guess that's sort of your journey, not mine. You were in a podcast interview I listened to with you. You talked a bit about wanting to inspire people to kind of get out there and live their dreams, and I see that in your story. But just talking with you here tonight, I feel like there's more to it. You've talked about balance and black and white, and there's a sort of a sense of ambivalence about the idea that just, getting out there and living your dreams isn't the whole story. So I'm just kind of wondering, is that in fact your whole message, or is there something more you want people to get out of this story?
Well, I mean, that's the easy thing for me to default to is I've always had a taste for the zestful life, let's say, in my years. And a lot of times it's always been baffling to me for people to say, God, I wish I had a bike, or God, I wish I could go do that. I wish I could go to, on this vacation or something. And I've always thought, well, why don't you, live your life? And I always tried to, and I could get tied up in the work and stuff like anybody else, right? And stress over finances or whatever might be going on in your life. But, I've always thought that was important. And after going through the first heart surgery at 34, the diary that I kept is what became my first book, Bouncing Off Guardrails. And it was just a diary that I kept for myself because I was trying to make sense of this is like, you just had to stare death in the face, and be happy with it and be okay with it. And that's something that's very impactful, especially at a young age where you don't expect to go through that. And after that, I just really focused on keep the stress low, enjoy life. If you want to do something, like I'd never gone on vacation with my buddy to the mountains, but that next September, I rode my Aprilia up there 8 hours with him, and I sent it over a mountainside 40 minutes into the curves. And, we pulled it up, and I rode it all weekend and had a blast. So I think it's something that if I can leave anything as a message, it's to just get out and enjoy life. And I guess what, I've been through personally with my own health and near misses, and with, having lost sunshine that way and everything else, that's like one of the most important things to me, I guess. If I can leave one message with somebody is, enjoy life. It's so short. And I see people just trudging through it, and they're not happy at their job. They're not happy with their life. They don't do anything good with it. They don't take care of themselves. They're not healthy. And it's just awful for me to see that, because it's so precious, and they don't realize it until it's too late. And that's a hard thing for anybody to watch. Now, that said, we talked earlier about being an extremist and not having much middle ground in some of these things. That is something that I think is very sad to see. But yet, if you show me, like, I don't know, like, as far as the empathy thing goes, I just don't have much of it. If I know somebody and they're close to me, then yeah, I can be very, much protective of them or whatever. But somebody that I don't know or have any kind of never met or bond with, I don't have that genuine empathy, like, oh, no human should do this, have to go through this. Like, well, whatever, they'll figure it out. I had to figure my life out. They'll figure theirs out. And so I don't have much for sympathy and empathy. But that said, there's a couple moments that really stick out as having made a difference in someone's life. One of them was when I came out with the first book. I had somebody reach out to me on Facebook who had read the book, and we still chat once in a while today, but he said, I had been told that I had only a few years to live. I was smoking, drinking my life away, not taking care of myself. And I read your book, and I have quit drinking. I've quit smoking. I'm starting to go for walks. And and I've watched him. He bought a dog, then he got his bike again, and then he's, got his new truck he's enjoying. And that was actually pretty amazing to me, to be able to do something, just being myself and being honest about it, and having that make that much of an impact in someone's life. That to me was actually a win, right? If you can do something like that, if I can have fun and be crazy and risk myself, that's all fine, and have a blast in life. But if I can make someone else even think about doing that as well, that's huge. That now I've made a positive difference.
Yeah, that's it's interesting that was his reaction. That's what you'd hope for, and it's not as I don't know. It's not as nihilistic, I guess, as it might seem on the surface. So, No Limits, No Regrets is the name of your film, and I know that you have that tattooed on your left arm, as I recall. Does that still accurately describe your philosophy? Is that still who you are?
I think so. And part of that comes from, I remember when I was younger, some of the choices Dad made, I was kind of like, well, I don't understand why he did that. That seems like stubbornness getting in the way of maybe the wiser choice or something, and it is, when you're a kid, you're absorbing as you go, and you kind of wonder about things once in a while. And one time many years later, I heard him talking to an uncle or something, and he said, I've got no regrets. And I thought, anybody that can look back on their life and say, there's nothing I'd really do differently. I'm happy with where I am and what I've done. I thought that's a big deal to be able to say that. And when I went into my first heart surgery, my little sister, the youngest one, she's 8 years younger, was sitting next to me, and she was shaking. And I was just calm, sitting there. And she said, I don't know how you can be sitting there that calm. She goes, this, like, you might go to sleep here in a half hour and never wake up. And I said, yeah, but look at all the positives. And she kind of looks at me, and I said, think about it. I got advance notice. I was able to say my goodbyes, go see my friends and stuff, tell everybody goodbye. I got to go out this weekend for Halloween with my buddy in Denver and had a good time there. I'm getting to see you and spend time with you and the other sister, out there. And I've done everything I want. I've had a very full life, and I've got to experience all these great things. And if all I do is take a nap and don't wake up, what's wrong with that? I couldn't ask for a better situation. And so I think that just reinforced the importance of not looking back and being mad at yourself or wishing you'd done something different. Because if you're always looking in the rear view, you're not watching the road ahead, right? And you're not enjoying where you are. And so I think that still really rings true. Is it would be easy for me to have not done the movie and said, this is too much work, or, not finish it, or, quit on the bike or quit on anything. But I feel like if you start putting those limits on yourself, you're not living life to the fullest. And I'm fine with failing. I've failed at so many things in my life, but I'm good with it, because if I fail, I know that I put my effort into it. Usually I'm learning something in the process, and I'm just going to come out better on the other side. And I have a new experience in my tool belt, right, that I can carry with me. So
right.
I think it's very much still the way I like to live.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that last part, it was, spoken like a true engineer, actually. It's I feel like you would need something with wings to beat this ride. And I'm sure that people ask you what you're going to do next. And I know you've got some plans, in the near future. You're going to go back to the Texas Mile. This question's a bit different from that, in the sense that I'm thinking about a longer time horizon. So let's imagine that Axe somehow lives a very long life, and you're sitting in your rocking chair, 50 years from now, looking out at that, beautiful Texas hill country. What's the big prize you want to look back on? Was this it, or is there something else, something, that if you last that long, you might do?
Yeah, wow, so I've obviously given this thought. It's something that you can't help but think about, like, would I go back and beat my own record or something? And this, to me, is pretty hard to beat. I mean, for me, this kind of puts a bow on things, right? Like, I've done the ride. I did the book movie soundtrack. I've done everything with this project, and there it is. And now it's kind of like, well, what next, right? I can do like the Texas Mile, and I want to hop on the BMW and drive to Florida here, this year sometime, and maybe go take a Porsche racing school and stuff. And a lot of the little things like that. I think it's hard to beat what I've done, to me, I guess. Now, I did that ride at 40 years old. I don't, just for viewers' information, it's not like I was 25 doing that. I was 40 years old and, still pulling that nonsense. So it's not like I was a spring chicken, but, I've debated, like, maybe when I turn 50, I'd try it again, or maybe this time I'd do it, but I'd take my time and enjoy it. And that's one thing that's, we talked about extremes earlier. It's tough for me is, I like just getting in and going, right? Because that, to me, is part of the fun, is how fast can I make it there and ripping through. And it's hard for me to just stop and enjoy things sometimes. But, it'd be kind of fun to do, a trip and, actually take my time and just see a lot of stuff along the way in that. And, maybe I do, instead of the shortest, I take the longest way, and I go from the northwest corner all the way down to the Key West or something, and do a drive that way. And, I actually might have to sleep on that one. I don't know if I could make that whole distance without sleeping at this age, but, so I'm open to different things and kind of giving thought to them and stuff, but, nothing's really struck my fancy. And the hard part is what I did would be really hard to improve on. I think the only way you would be able to do that is somehow increase your fuel capacity that you're carrying with you and eliminate one or two fuel stops, which is only going to pick you up, a half hour each time. And then that assumes you don't end up with like a flat tire or any of the other 100 things that can go wrong. The other way you could do it faster is you just have to take the risk. Like, you just have to hammer the throttle and hope you don't get caught. But you'd have to be lucky to get, really down there in time.
Yeah.
And So I've given it some thought, but I'm, like I said, I feel like if I see 50, I probably owe myself some kind of a big ride. I don't know if it would be a speed ride or more of a, let's take it easy and just enjoy seeing America, and make my way across. So we'll see. That's still, I try to, like I said, I don't want to spend too much focus on the future. I want to just kind of enjoy what I'm doing now and getting the movie out there and enjoying having the bike back and the little events. And we'll see what one thing I've learned through life is if you make too many plans, they just always get screwed up. So I tend to have a very short window of vision in my life. And, I went back and I gave a talk to the old high school where I graduated. And I looked out at these kids that were, 18, and I was, I guess I was 20 years. I was 38 at the time. And it was before the record ride. And I said, man, if there's one thing I can tell you, it's like, you can make all the plans you want, but you have no idea what life is going to throw at you. I just, I can remember being back in your shoes 20 years ago and thinking, I'm going to do this and that and this. Had no idea what was going to happen. And so some of you may be lucky and find that, your plans work out great, but there's a lot of us that gotta, dig through it as we go.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what makes the best stories. And I kind of hope that you've been bitten by the bug of storytelling, because I thought the movie was a pretty well told tale, and I imagine that there will be people who watch it that look forward to some kind of a sequel or what happens next. Do you want to tell people, while we're on the subject, do you want to tell people how they can find your film and how they can find your books?
Yeah, sure. So my website is www.ychrome.com, and that's spelled with like the letter Y, CHROME.com. And on there is links to Amazon. You can go on Amazon and watch the movie digitally. There's trailers there, and then there's the link to the movie, and you can read the reviews and all that stuff. But I know most people will want to watch it digitally, but and you can go right to Amazon, of course, and just look for No Limits - No Regrets and find it that way. The website, though, for if anybody prefers to have a disc, like a DVD or Blu-ray, I have those as well. And so that can be ordered on my website. The book is available there. You can also get the book via Amazon as well. And it's on, you can get the ebook as well, too. And I have some collector sets. I've sold a few of them where I've done upgrades to the bike over the years. So every time I took a piece of the bike off, I saved it. And what I've sold is collector sets where people are getting like a book, soundtrack, and movie, and then a piece of the actual bike that made the ride. And then I sign and number all of them. Oh, wow. And they can have something like, if they want like a garage hanger or a desk piece, or something like that to talk about, that's an option too. And those are on my website.
Cool. That's a pretty cool idea. Axe, I can't thank you enough for speaking with me today. I'm sure I'm not the only one who wonders, what life is like so close to the edge. And, I think for me, part of what I enjoyed about your story was the peak over that edge. I wish you all kinds of success with your film and whatever else you put your mind to, and take care of yourself.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me on, Bruce. I really enjoyed chatting with you here. It's always good to talk to other bike people, and you try to stay warm up there. We're supposed to get down to like 18 degrees in Texas, and that's got people freaking out down here. So.
That's why God created whiskey. Oh dear. Yeah, my sympathy. At least you don't have to shovel it. Okay, well, that's I'll take those good wishes, and let's stay in touch. I'd love to see what you do next.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Bruce. You have a great night.
Bye now. You too. I had a whole different ending written for this episode, and then, the day before the final edit, I decided to play hooky and watch NASA's live stream of the Mars rover landing. Well, if you didn't see it, it was pretty dramatic in real time, as this stuff always is. NASA had cameras in the mission control room, and in those last few minutes, as the lander blazed its way towards the surface, you got to watch the faces of the people who made it happen. And despite all the resources and all the unimaginable preparation that went into that moment, those faces were not confident. They were anxious. Because this still might not work. Because sometimes audacity and preparation aren't enough. And so, when the room erupted in applause, well, you were right there with them, vicariously experiencing that very same rush. And I guess I finally got it. Now, please trust me that I am in no way comparing a historic mission to Mars with one person's covert attempt to break a speed record on his motorcycle. Except maybe in this one abstract, important sense. At one point early in our conversation, Axe said it's hard to have excitement without fear. And I may have let that comment pass too easily. I guess at first I assumed that he meant they were the same thing, fear and excitement. But that record-setting ride tells a different story. Set aside for a moment Axe's self-described addictive personality, and what emerges is something more complicated than just betting it all on red. Fear is just one element of a calculus that also includes discipline and self-awareness. And no matter how hard you fight it, a certain amount of luck. That's where the adrenaline comes in. The good kind of adrenaline. The kind where you bet on yourself and you win. Well, I still can't really relate to Axe's extremeness, but I can relate to that. And maybe you can too. Maybe that's why we ride. Not to gamble with our lives, but to pit our characters against fate in a contest where the real prize is the privilege of doing it again tomorrow. Because when it's all said and done, we all know that we'll never ride anything that goes as fast as life itself. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions about the show. Emailing me at thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I'm on Instagram if you want to say hi. I'm passing the winter by gawking at other people's bikes, and I'd love to see yours. That's also where you'll find many of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Axe DeKruif. This episode's playlist recommendation comes from another independent Canadian artist, this time from Montreal. The band is called Atoms to Ashes, and we found each other on Instagram commiserating about the long winter, something Montrealers are kind of experts at. Well, these guys have a fantastic work ethic. They were incredibly helpful, and their music is amazing. The track is called Blown Away. And if I had the nerve to point my bike at the sun and keep the throttle pinned for 33 hours and 10 minutes, this would probably be playing in my helmet. Buy it or stream it wherever you like to get your music. And in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.